Welcome to another video. This one's about the blackouts in Spain, which pretty well everyone knows about. Now, I've made a number of videos over the last few months, last 4 or 5 months, about this subject in advance of the blackout, pointing out the dangers of not stabilising the grid. And the video links to that are below. I've used hamsters on flywheels, etc. to get the message over. But as I say, you can look at those videos below, which give a much more detailed explanation of it all. Now, let me just explain it simply, though, without the need to do that. The grid, the national grid, has to be kept in balance, supply and demand. Now, if demand rises and supply doesn't, the frequency will drop, and that can knock the grid out. The slightest, even 0.5% or so, out on the frequency can cause troubles. So the frequency, which in our case is 50 cycles a second, has to be kept correct. Now, traditionally, by the way, the opposite of that is if supply increases and demand doesn't, the frequency will increase, whereas if it drops, it'll decrease. It's pretty simple, really. And to balance it, in the past, we didn't have to worry. And the reason was the nuclear, the coal, the oil, the gas, all those which have turbines, the hydro, all have turbines which have big flywheels turning at 50 cycles a second, 3000 RPM. And those, and that inertia in that system means if there's a hiccup, it just carries on. And so this inertia, that's what we call it, inertia in the system, is vital. Now, we didn't have to worry about it in the past. It was inbuilt and it was free, if you like. But with renewables, like solar and wind, I'll just discuss those two. The electricity is dirty. It doesn't have any stabilization to it. It's just an energy that's there, but there's no cycle underneath it. There's no stabilization. And so there are different ways you can add to that, and one is flywheels. So if you have gigantic flywheels just turning at high speeds, normally built in vacuums, so they have very little frictional loss. In fact, the frictional loss is at a rate of about 100 watts in many of them, which is tiny. That's a tenth of a kilowatt. So the actual maintaining that way is quite small, but they cost an awful lot to actually put in. The installation per kilowatt hour can be thousands of pounds, as it were. So they're quite expensive to put in. And in Britain, we proposed 100 of those at one time. I did a video on that to try to stabilise this dirty power from solar and wind. And if you think about it as dirty power, that's about right. Now, another way of doing this is with battery farms. You can actually very quickly call on the electricity, or take some of the charge away in the same way as a flywheel. And that's the main purpose. It's not to back up wind and solar in any sense of long term. We're looking at milliseconds and seconds here. And in fact, the battery farms are paid to stand by and do things like that. So they're just paid to do nothing else but that. That's their main role. All these are extra costs, by the way, on top of traditional power. So they're the two things that can be used. Now, in Spain, they were warned about this. So the first part of this, the grid stability went out, because as soon as you get something going wrong, and that happens all the time, there isn't enough inertia to keep it going. Now, if you're going to heat an electric fire with electricity and the frequency drops a bit, it'll still heat you, it'll still work. But a motor won't. So, and that's why I know on the boat we had major troubles in America getting a replacement washing machine, because of course they're 60 cycles and we were on 50 cycles on an energy system, and so that is important. So with motors it's critical. But in Spain, well before this, there were warnings. Well before the blackout, there were warnings of instability caused by this lack of frequency stability, and we're going to go into that. So the first part of this video is about the warnings in Spain that were there for all to see, and before the blackouts, the warnings. Repsol, one of Spain's largest energy providers, warned of shutdowns days before the historic Spanish blackout. What was happening? Well, on April the 22nd, they had problems with the electricity supply coming in. The frequency was up the spout, to put it bluntly, and the safety systems shut down the entire plant. And, that's a big problem. By the way, this plant does biofuels, all sorts of biofuels. It's part of the renewable madness. But in doing that, of course, the biofuels and that type of plant, just like coal, have turbines that have built-in flywheels, if you like, built-in inertia. And so itself, it doesn't produce dirty electricity. It produces what we should call clean electricity, as opposed to what solar and wind produces, which solar and wind just fluctuates willy-nilly, as it were, and doesn't have that inertia at all. So inertia has to be added. And on the very same day as that utility had to cut out and close down, there were also high-speed rail disruptions between different places in Spain, caused again by instability of the grid, because of course transport requires motors, and the motors are highly sensitive to changes in frequency, because that's what motors depend on, a solid frequency being supplied in the grid. Now, one may think that when there are blackouts, that's because of shortage of power, but no, in this case, and increasingly in the future, it's going to be because of too much power. That's right, too much power. So you increase the power, but you haven't got the demand to absorb it. The frequency increases, becomes unstable. All sorts of automatic systems have to detect this, because it causes big problems, and they shut down. Even countries will shut down another supply because it's too dirty, the electricity coming in. Okay, and in Spain's case, the problem seems to be caused by too much power. So let's look at that. Now, Spain at least has got a lot of sun, like Britain, but it has really gone bonkers on solar. And again, in Spain, it's the politicians that have controlled the entire strategic plan here. And they don't know what they're doing. They're just like children, just like they are in this country, although we have a particularly bad one in Ed Miliband. Anyway, here's a typical installation in Spain. And, quite dramatic, quite big, incredible it seems. It's free energy from the sun. Well, it's at least not that. It's very expensive energy. But it's best to explain the problem by me showing you the national grid in Britain and what's happening to us. The blue here is gas. The orange is the solar coming in the middle of the day. And the green is the wind. The purple are the imports. Now, you can see how the solar comes in the middle of the day. And basically, the gas has to get out of the way. And the wind can't give any more, so the gas gets out the way for the solar. And in doing that, it has to stand by and waste a lot of energy. In fact, in standby, some of the gas plants use 50% of the fuel they use at full output. So there's all sorts of extra costs. But now imagine that solar orange part really growing. And even if you do away with the imports, you're going to have excessive solar. And of course, here we are. Miliband is mad on increasing the solar. And we're going to end up in the same position as Spain, where the solar, in the middle of the day, the sun comes, it's a good day, and it exceeds the demand. And they haven't cut it out in time. They have to manage it better. But it's dirty power. It needs more inertia. Well, of course, at this point, if you look, most of our energy is coming from the wind and the solar. So it's dirty energy, and it needs stabilizing. And it's a bit like a tightrope walker, trying to balance on a tightrope. And the slightest bit out of balance, if you haven't got that inertia to keep you there, that balance to keep you there, it goes off and you fall off. Returning to Spain. A review of Spain's electrical grid over the past week shows a growing pattern: excessive solar generation during peak hours, and it regularly surpasses demand. Now, we know you can't allow that to happen. Industry experts have long warned about this risk, which has forced Red Electrica to curtail production at multiple solar farms to maintain balance. And by the way, almost probably would be in Britain actually paying for the curtailed power. You still have to pay for it. Maintaining a 24/7 alignment between electricity generation and consumption is critical for grid stability. However, the surge in renewables, particularly solar, during peak hours is making that task increasingly difficult. With Spain's energy mix heavily reliant on wind and solar, two inherently intermittent sources, I call them dirty electricity, the risks of grid instability are rising, driven by the government's energy transition roadmap under the National Energy and Climate Plan. So you see, politicians are trying to force a mismanagement of the grid, just like they are in the UK. It's politicians doing this. It's stupid people. It's children in charge of us doing these stupid things. And the result was a total blackout. Hospitals have to turn on generators. People caught in tunnels on trains. Road transport brought to a halt. You name it. Once the grid goes, everything goes. But our Ed Miliband, our energy minister, is blindfolded to all this. He has actually less than the understanding of a young child in how to run the system. He's a zealot, and no matter what damages he does to people, no matter what damages he does to the economy, no matter what industry he ruins, he's determined to plough ahead against all the facts that are right in front of him, but he will not face them. And of course, the blackout occurred on April the 28th at 12:30 local time. Peak solar time. That's when it occurred. The extra solar increased the frequency. They couldn't lower the energy fast enough, and the result was it started a cascade. And it is like a cascade, because one thing begets another through the system. And you know, in the UK, it could take a week to put our grid back together again. It could take a week to turn it on again. It's not that simple. There's only certain places that you can actually start the whole process of starting the regeneration of all the different power plants, etc. So in this report here, I tried to find out how many flywheels were there in Spain to try to stabilise this growing dirty energy grid. And the answer was it looks like just the one. And the one has a maximum here of 1.65 megawatts output. And that can last for about 12 seconds. And that may not seem much, but actually we're talking about milliseconds here to give a chance for something else to turn down or turn up, etc. So in the battery systems in Britain, we have to pay them to manage to the millisecond or to the few seconds. Do we have different schemes to try to help? Because that's what battery farms are for, not for bridging the gap really. They're for mainly just for stabilising the frequency. They're just an additional cost on top of the wind and the solar and so on, are one of many additional costs. And so it's clear here that Spain hasn't done that much because it failed, didn't it? Now, referring to the UK, the physicist engineer Brian Catt stated this after the Spain incident. The same thing will be done this summer, with more and more wind and solar in the UK summers. When we already can get down to 6 gigawatts of dispatchable supply, that means supply and demand, such as nuclear and so on, created by steam turbines, nuclear plus tracks, out of 25 gigawatts of summer demand. This is a wholly irresponsible and also most expensive way to run the grid. All grids run this way will fail because they have no inherent stability connected to the grid in real time to cope with generation failures, substation explosions. Whatever perturbs the grid can take it down in a 50th of a second by design. All imposed by the delusionary, stupid net zero laws of ignorant politicians, which make the grid avoidably unstable by the deliberate act of grid operator, demanded by an irresponsible government, when much safer operating conditions are possible. They instead order the grid to be taken to the edge of reason and beyond by the laws of politicians. Well, Brian, I couldn't have said it better myself, so I decided to use your quote instead of mine. I'll draw this video to a close there with Brian's quote because it sums it up. We are not being run by any sensible people. We are having quangos and heads of major things being put in who have no understanding of what they're managing. None at all. It's a really mad hatter world, okay? And our energy system is at the edge of a tightrope. And the energy system will inevitably fall off. Thank you for watching. There are 2 videos I've listed below this video that you can watch. They were made prior to the Spanish incident. One is called The Ed Miliband Flywheel Myth and the other one is 90 Billion Lost, a lesson from a hamster by Ed Miliband.